I guess I was 16 when I heard Working Man's Dead and American Beauty, which that was one of those touchstone moments, and those records were touchstones. And the Europe Live 73 album and Wake of the Flood were kind of those records in particular were just so important to me. And it's funny, my folks let me, I guess I was probably 11 or something, or this record store just gave me, in my dad's hometown of Lexington, Virginia, these record companies would have these promotional kind of stand-up things. So there was the Grateful Dead, Pigpen was still alive and everything. And so my folks, it's like I say, they didn't, they weren't like, wait a minute, Grateful Dead. What does that mean? What's that supposed to mean? They were fine. And then I remember getting a book of lyrics and music of the Grateful Dead. I guess I was probably a senior in high school, and they were fine. They were very supportive. But I hadn't listened to them when I had this poster. I just thought it was cool. Jerry actually, too, before I heard Working Man's Dead and American Beauty, when I was working at that college radio station, I got the Garcia album came out. And that really blew my mind. And I was already really digging the sound of the pedal steel, and I loved Jerry's playing, and would hear pedal steel on a bunch of stuff, but there was something about just everything he was doing and the tone of his playing and his voice I just really loved, and the songs and Robert Hunter's lyrics, and but I never got to meet Jerry. But several years later, I was mentioning that bluegrass record I did with Roland White that I couldn't get a deal for it, and then we lost the masters to it, and then Roland's wife found, I think it was 7 years ago, found a copy of a reel-to-reel. And so we put it out. But my first official release was with Ralph Stanley and the Clinch Mountain Boys. And so I contacted Robert through a friend of mine named Rob Bleetstein, who lives in San Rafael, where Robert does. And Rob is very connected with the Grateful Dead world. And so Robert and I started writing. And the embarrassing thing too is, and this was in 1997 or 8, whatever, but I didn't know how to use the internet. And I just kept thinking, it's like, oh man, I don't want to mess with that. I don't have time to learn how to do that. Why do I need that? And so
that's what I did. Now look at me.
Right. See? Well, see, you've made progress. But and that was the thing that kind of turned the tide for me. It's like, I need to learn how to do this, because I did have a fax machine, and he faxed me some lyrics, but then I had to overnight him a melody on a cassette. And but then I learned. But Robert liked the melody I put to this lyric, and then he suggested a song. He had a poem in this book, Box of Rain, and he said a melody hasn't been put to that, and it's called I Will Wait for You. So I put a melody to it, and he approved it. And Ralph Stanley liked both of them. And then the next record I did with Ralph, we had a couple of co-writes, Robert and I, and he liked them. And Ralph would always say to me when I'd audition songs to him, and when I was doing both of these records, on the first record, I did a few songs there were a couple of Stanley Brothers songs and a Bill Monroe song that Ralph had never recorded. And then but my writing for it was very last minute. And that's the way I work a lot, unfortunately. It just all kind of comes together. It's like I have to do it. And yeah. And but whenever I'd audition songs for Ralph and he didn't like them, his way of saying that was after listening to it, he'd go, Jim, I think you ought to save that for your next record. Don't you think so? So, and then I just go, yeah, okay, yeah. But that was a great experience to work with Ralph and the guys. And but Robert came to Nashville for a while after the recording of those first songs with Ralph. And he stayed a few months, and he stayed at I got him a room at the Spence Manor, which is it's still there. The building's still there. I'm surprised with all of the kind of construction and on Music Row. And for you folks listening, Music Row is this neighborhood in Nashville, which was a residential neighborhood, but record companies came in and publishers and studios. And for a while, Music Row, that many blocks, it was 95% music biz related. And now there are apartments and condos and there's still some publishing companies, there's some record companies there. Everything's, changed as life does. But Robert was staying at the Spence Manor, and I'd go visit him. And he's, oddly enough, when I'm talking about being inhibited and too shy around some people, I was around Robert, but that was an instance where I made myself be in his company, even, and he was a super nice guy. But it was, being around him, though, it was kind of like, this is Robert Hunter. But I had to, I think also too, he was so intelligent and so well read and just listened to everything that I felt like Jethro Bodine hanging out with him, because I just, I was afraid to sound like a complete idiot around him. But he was, that was just the way he was. And but I would leave usually, and sometimes my writing, the way it goes, and Robert would do the lyrics and I'd do the melodies. And a lot of times in conversation with Robert sitting there, a melody would come to me. And so I'd put it down on a cassette in the early days and give him the cassette. And then I'd go out on the road for a few days or whatever and come back and he'd have a lyric. And he really enjoyed being here. And but then he decided to go back. He didn't want to stay. He didn't want to move here, but went back. And we wrote about 33 songs when he was here. And I made a record called Headed for the Hills, an acoustic record. Except the last cut had my friends Donna the Buffalo on it who I had been playing with, and that's electric. And Bucky Baxter did play some steel on there too. And then Robert and I ended up writing about 100 songs, but I made records total of about 6 albums of stuff that we had written. And there's still, I'm finding every once in a while, because I'm very unorganized, it's like there's a lyric. And so I hope to finish another album of stuff, and some of the very early stuff we wrote too. And usually when he'd give me a lyric, it would be like that, a melody would come out. And same with Robert. Usually when I'd give him a melody, he'd go in the other room for a little while, come out and be here. And then sometimes we wrote in a few days an album, or most of an album. But he was, and I'd tell him, and especially in the last few years, I wouldn't pressure him. I got worried that sometimes when I'd call him and say, hey, I'm going to the studio next week, that I did that once, and he said, listen, I'm getting ready to go on. I'm preparing for a tour, and I've got to practice. I'm not in a writing mode right now. But I got too worried that I was like overstepping my bounds after some of these kind of marathon sessions at his place. And so for the last few years of his life, when I'd go out there to California, I'd let him know and go and have lunch. His wife, Maureen, would make lunch or dinner, and his daughter, Katie, would be there some. And it was a good way to just try to be a friend. And I really am glad that he was receptive to that, and and that I didn't have some kind of songwriting agenda, but to just be there with him. And I'd tell him the last few times I saw him, I said, that beer commercial where they say the most interesting man in the world, you're the most interesting man in the world. And then the last time I saw him, his eyes, it was like when I looked in his eyes, it was just like there was something different. And it was later, I wrote something about this. I said, it was like that song, which is one of my favorites. It's on Wake of the Flood, Eyes of the World. It was like when I looked in his eyes, it was like walking into another world. It was really, really something. And he was at peace too. And his wife, Maureen, is wonderful, and his daughter, Katie, and his extended family. And, but he was, and he knew, he wanted to go out and see Roland White and Del McCurry. He was, and he, when we were doing that first album here, of acoustic people, he was like, see if you can get Gillian Welch and David Rawlings on here, See Buddy Miller? Yes, get Buddy Miller. Emmy Lou? Yes, and Tim O'Brien. Yeah. Daryl Scott? Yes, And there's a bass player, Byron House, that had played in several Grateful Dead cover bands. And so I knew it's like, I need to get Byron on this record. So that all really worked out with people. And and Peter Cooper, I introduced him with, we went out to dinner, and then one time I was out on the road, and he and Peter went out too, but Peter really enjoyed hanging with him, and he enjoyed Peter. And there was a friend of mine that's a fiddle player named Ollie O'Shea. We were in several bands together, and he lives in New Mexico now, but he could really kind of hold his own talking about books around Robert. And so that was cool, and that made him feel at home.
Years ago, I heard Barry Gibb say that he would come up with a melody, and then if it stuck in his head, he would stick with that melody no matter what, and the words had to fit it. If you gave a melody to Robert Hunter, how much would he honor the melody that you gave him lyrically?
Robert would, pretty much. There were a few times where it seemed like the syllables, it wasn't quite what I was hearing, but I'd make it work. And one thing, the fellow that ran the publishing company for the Dead, when I first got with Robert in person, I asked him, I said, do you have any pointers, And he said, whatever you do, don't change a lyric, or don't say, hey, what about blah, blah, blah. So I was working on a record, and we did Headed for the Hills, this record. Tim Coates, this great engineer, producer here in town, was the Gary Talent, the bass player, had the studio called Moondog Studios. It was over off of White Bridge Road. And it was one of those studios where it was a gutted house. And that kind of became my go-to place for several years as a songwriter. When I started getting cuts from other people, I would book studio time and just go there. And so Tim, it was great, so great working with him. And but one time Tim and I recorded a melody, and I couldn't finish the lyrics, so I got a hold of Robert. I sent him the tracks, and I was kind of under the gun, but I didn't want to make Robert feel pressured. And this lyric on this one phrase just wasn't quite happening. And so I remember saying to Robert, hey, how about blah, blah? I was on the phone, and he didn't dig that. And so that was the only time. But he would, if he gave me a lyric and I was putting a melody to it, he would sometimes go, no, it's got to be, this. And he, would be very specific about certain things. But he knew his stuff. And also on that first record, there was a song called High Timberline, which I got Emmy Lou to sing on. And there was this, I recorded it and then sent it to him. And then he said, it's missing something. At the end of this phrase of High Timberline, repeat that and go way up on High Timberline. And I was thinking to myself, I've already recorded this, And the same thing happened with Harlan Howard on something, and so I re-recorded it, and it was like, yeah, that makes it. Robert actually, he had a really great melodic sense and could write melodies too, but he was just this out of this world lyricist, so.